Hello again, everybody. This is Dan Clouser, and welcome back to the Journey My Mother's Son podcast. Today I'm joined with fellow author Noah Asher, who just published his newest book, Chaos Overcoming the Overwhelming. Noah, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Really looking forward to having this conversation. I always love having fellow authors on the show, just talking about the creative process and what inspired them and all that fun stuff. But before we get started, just introduce yourself to the audience. Who is Noah today?
I am officially an author. That's the book that just came out, Chaos. This is my first book. And I'm also a business owner. I own a consulting firm. And we currently are doing a lot of, I have a team around me that's doing a lot of advocacy for prison reform and some more specifically reentry reform.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about that in particular. Why is that an interest of yours?
Uh, Almost a decade ago now, I was incarcerated myself. And through that time, I realized that when you get out, there's there's a lot that you have to do to be successful. And I realized I was so underprepared. There was no sort of tools or resources for me. And thankfully, I'm just so blessed to have had an officer who realized that, all right, I'm going to be the one that picks up the hammer, but he's going to be the ones that hands me the nails, and we're going to rebuild together, and we're going to do this together. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't have that experience. And so I really, really, really believe this is my purpose to help people get these services that they need. Because something that I've been telling US senators recently is bottom line is if you want to fix recidivism, you have to fix rehabilitation.
Right.
And so that's where it starts. And that's one of the things we're working on. A lot of it really comes down to states. It's a state regulated form of an issue. And so we're starting in Georgia and we're just moving around from there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. I don't think people understand how vicious of a cycle it is. Once somebody's incarcerated, the likelihood of them returning to incarceration after they're out is very high. Um, and a lot of it is, you know, again, because of that system, um, isn't so much about rehabbing as it is about, quote unquote punishment. Um,
Right.
and I think the true path to that is to get people back into society who can then become productive members of society. But like you said, when you were first out, you weren't given the tools to be
Right.
successful. So many times people, they try, like when they first get out, they try, um, and after constantly being turned down for jobs because of their record and a whole slew of other things, they slowly go back into that same lifestyle that led them
Yes.
to incarceration to begin with. So
Right.
um, I love the fact that you're working to change that. But it is a monster task
Yeah.
because the society is so set in its ways. So tell me why is it such a passion for you? I mean, a lot of people, it's like, hey, I'm only worried about me. I got myself straightened out. Everybody else can figure it out the way I had to. Why do
Yeah.
you want to help other people?
I love that question. It all starts with Genesis 50:20 for me. And that verse is something that we see a lot of times, and a lot of Christians have it on their walls. They bought it from Hobby Lobby. And it says, what the enemy intended for evil, God used for good. And that's the rest, that's what they have. But the verse actually does not end there. It actually says, what the enemy intended for evil, God used for good to save many. And those three words changed the game for me because I'm sure while Joseph was in his pit, he wanted a ladder. He wanted to get up out of it as quickly as possible. That would have been the quick resolution that we all desire when we're in our chaos. But 13 years of his life was pit, prison, and then palace. And in that moment, it's if he would have gotten the ladder ahead of time, he would not have been used by God to help free a whole nation. And I think for me, that verse was the game changer for me, where I go, you know what the enemy intended for evil, God's not turning it around just for my good. He's turning it around for good to help save many. And through this whole book of chaos, that's one thing that I really try to push is that your pain, your past has a purpose. And in your purpose is where hopefully you'll birth a platform. And for me, this is my purpose, this is my platform. And it all started with pain and it all started with my own past. And this is something that's not just for me. It's something that's going to help generations of people because if we fix the problem, the root of the problem, not only are we getting people to break that recidivism cycle, but we're also bettering our communities. We're putting people back out there that can be successful. And that's ultimately what matters. You know, this is a bipartisan sort of process because you have some people who are going, we don't want to spend any money. What can we do? And I'm like, okay, I understand you don't want to spend any money. Great. But do you know how much you're already spending on recidivism?
Right.
I'm not saying let's spend more money. Let's just take the money from recidivism and put it into reentry because then you're building people and setting people up for success. You're taking you're giving kids back their father, you're giving kids back their mother, right? And
Yeah.
that's what matters. And so that's what we're doing. But it was all birthed out of my own pain and my own pit.
Yeah. Yeah. How long did it take you, um, while you were incarcerated to, a lot of times people initially want to blame others for the situation they're in, and it isn't
Yeah.
until you actually own it yourself till you can actually really rehabilitate. What was that process like for you? Was there a lot of playing the blame game initially, or were you able to kind of own it pretty early on?
Uh, it's kind of I laugh because I was just talking to a friend about this, is that it's different. It's different for me in a lot of ways, but it's the same story that a lot of people have shared. And it starts with I actually grew up going to church. I grew up knowing about God, but it was all knowledge, not relationship. And so for me, I was before incarceration, I was actually consulting long before ever getting arrested. I was helping businesses, but I was also helping churches grow. Isn't that crazy?
Wow.
And it's because
Wow.
I knew all the right things to say. You know, I knew all the right Bible verses. I was very knowledgeable, but no relationship. And it was in my darkest pit where I was laying there and I go, God, I know who you are, but we don't have a connection. And then I started kind of manipulating the situation because I was so miserable. I was like, God, if you love me, you'll let me die. And because I've heard about your love, I've read about your love. And if I know that if you love me as your son, you're not going to want to see me in pain, and I'm in pain. And I want to do anything to get out of here. And he didn't take my life, and I was mad at him for not doing that. And then so I tried to take my own life, and then I couldn't do that. Like it didn't work. I'm still here, obviously. And so I was mad at myself for not being able to kill myself properly. So I'm mad at God, I'm mad at myself. And then it was just sitting there, and it was almost before I even accepted responsibility, I had to accept my physical placement, which was that cell. And I realized this is where I'm at. No matter how much I punch a wall, like I'm still here. This is where
Right.
I am. And so I had to accept my placement and then accept the responsibility. And people have different forms of accepting responsibility, but for me, that's what it was. I'm like, this is my new normal for a moment, not forever, but this is my new normal for a moment, and it's because of my own sin that led me here. And the thing about, you know, addiction and the things that like that is the enemy will try so hard to make that be who you are that you lose sight of reality is that Jesus still loves you, no matter what you've done. And so I started then going to this through this process of I'm just a horrible human being. I'm just an inmate. I'm an inmate with a number, you know, and uh, I had to break that cycle along later on. But in that moment, accepting responsibility started with accepting where I was. Like this is where I was going to be.
Right. Right. And then once you accepted that, there's a whole nother process you touched on a little bit of you know, you can seek God's forgiveness, but then there comes a time it's you can get God's forgiveness pretty easily.
Yeah.
It's very difficult at times to forgive yourself. So, you touched on a little bit, but dig a little deeper into that, what that forgiving yourself process was like for you.
Yeah, chaos really can come in many different forms. For me, it was incarceration. For some, it's rejection. For some, it's divorce. For some, it's loss. But no matter what your chaos is, I feel like one thing that we can all agree upon is that the enemy will wants to make you go through this identity crisis where you start to believe, I am just a number, I am just an inmate, or if you've been divorced, it's like, oh, I am just this person that my ex said I was. You start to believe all these lies of the enemy. And for me, it was I had to break myself of that. The best way for me to describe it is in my book, I call it the grace filter, and I talk about the story of Simba in The Lion King and how his uncle said that, hey, you murdered your father, so he runs away. He believes the lies of the enemy that he's a murderer. And it wasn't until his father showed up in the sky and says, Simba, remember who you are. And that was when he kind of woke up and realized, yeah, I'm more than just what someone has said about me. And then in that moment, that's when things started to shift for him. And I think things start to shift for us when we start to remember who we are and remember whose we are. And it starts with understanding the basics like, yes, you are God's son, you are God's daughter, but you're also royalty. You have to start kind of going through that list of all the things God has said you really are. And I look at the story of Zacchaeus and the tax collector. It was such a bad term, right? You don't want to be a tax collector. And
Right.
for him, uh, Jesus refers to Zacchaeus as a son of Abraham. And I think that's so beautiful um, because we know who Abraham is, and he's chosen, he's loved, and he knows that there's a future. That's the name of Abraham. That's what's put on the life of Abraham and all of Abraham's descendants. And so for Jesus not to call Zacchaeus tax collector, but to refer to him as son of Abraham says a lot about us when we do something wrong, is he doesn't see us as our sin. He sees us as his chosen son or daughter of God.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. So, what are some of the obstacles or frustrations that you've experienced since you've been out um, trying to change the system? Because again, I touched on it earlier, where it's a monumental task to change the system, and it is something that should be bipartisan. But uh, dealing with politics can be quite quite frustrating in its own right, and
Yeah.
dealing with politicians in particular. So, what have some of the frustrations been throughout this process, and how have you overcome those?
Anyone who's ever worked with me knows I'm the type of person who goes, hey, here's the problem, here's the solution, let's do it now. And politics is more of, oh, here's the problem, here's the solution, give me 3 years. And that drives me insane, but
Yeah,
that's just part of it sometimes. And so I feel like we're not moving sometimes of course, the rate I want, but I feel like we're sometimes just stalled and that can be frustrating. But it's to just point back to I know where the end goal is, and I do believe we're getting there. We're seeing some major strides already, and so that's what I have to focus on is the end, knowing that there's a prize at the at the finish line, and holding out for that but also being proactive in other ways. And so it's like, okay, I know that I want to see better reentry programs for people. Cool. While we're waiting for that to happen, what can I do for the people who are getting out now or who are in a lot of what I speak for or speak to are rehab centers and addiction centers. So it's like I want to give that message of hope now while we wait for the slow spinning wheel of politics to take place.
right, right. What are do you have any success stories in particular that you'd like to share? That you've been able to witness. Obviously you're a huge success story, but what are some of the ones that you've helped? Do you have any that pop off the top of your head that you'd like to share?
I think ultimately, especially with that chapter I mentioned about the grace filter, I think that a lot of people that have said that they've already read the book and have connected with me have said that that chapter made them. I like to speak with and write with hope, help, humor. And one thing that they have said about that chapter specifically is that they have laughed and they have cried in one chapter alone. And it's because I try to be vulnerable about going, hey, I try to end my life. You know, I've been here, done this, I've done this, I've done this. And I then point them to the Savior. But the reality is they're sitting there going, I've been there too. And I wanted to give up and I've thought about giving up. Yet, this sort of chapter has been graciously written to help people understand that they are more than their past mistakes. When you think about like the prodigal son, I hear I would say most of the stories I hear are like identical to the prodigal son story, identical. How they went away and then they came back to the father. But it all starts with when I think about the prodigal son story is how uh the son on the way back to the father was rehearsing, like, okay, when I get to the father, I'm gonna tell him I'm unworthy. And so he just kept believing that and rehearsing, I'm unworthy, I'm unworthy, I'm unworthy. And if you say that enough, you're gonna believe it. And I've worked with so many people who just think that I'm an addict. I'm unworthy. I'm a lost cause. But it wasn't until they had that moment of awakening to go, you know what? I'm not a lost cause. I'm a found child. And it's just that wake up call that I'm really loving to hear and the stories I love to see because that's why we do what we do is to make sure people have that moment where they just something lights up in their head or they finally hear that knock at the door
Right.
that Jesus refers to.
Yeah. Yeah. How, again, as a fellow author and understanding that the writing process when you're writing a memoir, you are really, you know, exposing yourself and putting yourself out there and allowing yourself to be vulnerable. How difficult was that process for you to, really kind of just strip down and say, here I am.
When I started writing this book, it was really just for me, it was therapy. It was very therapeutic to just say, we're going to get through this, we're going to get through this. And then I was like, there's something here. So I started writing more and developing this book. And the first round was more about just people's stories about how I've worked with people and seen people overcome. They're overwhelming because that's like the tagline. But then I realized after a lot of prayer and getting with my team and having them pray, we really realized like I cannot not mention my story in this book because it's a Christian nonfiction. You mentioned memoir. I actually try to strip away from that because I don't want people to think this is all about me because who am I? So they don't really know who I am. So it's not a fun read if you don't know me. But I went back and added the parts of my story throughout because I realized, you know what? Not only does scripture tell us to by the words of our testimony, so we need to be able to discuss our testimony, but for me it was I didn't I wanted people to understand when they read something like this, like who's this guy? Why is he talking about victory? Why is he talking about conquering? I wanted them to hear a little bit of my story to know, hey, I've been there, done that. So I'm trying to walk you through what I've seen God do in my own life, but also what he's seen do in other people's lives.
Yeah, and I think that's so powerful. When people see that someone else went through it and overcame it, it gives them hope that they can get through it and overcome it and, come out on the other side, not just surviving, but thriving as well. So,
Yeah, and to answer your other question though, like the vulnerability part has not been fun. Unfortunately, uh not everyone is not everyone's kind. Not everyone is willing to accept change. And for me though, it took, and I talk about it in the book, but in a chapter I actually call "Haters Gonna Hate," which is like a Taylor Swift song. But in that chapter I talk about Saul, like his Saul to Paul transformation. And for me, I finished editing that chapter while I was rebuilding. And one thing, because we're always rebuilding, so like just as I was in the aftermath of my own chaos, and after seeing certain people groups act certain way, then I realized, you know what? If we don't believe that Jesus can turn Saul's into Paul's, then we don't believe in the power of Jesus. We missed one of the biggest miracles that we see Jesus do, and it's a miracle of a heart change. It's crazy to me that Christians and just people in general can believe that God can part the Red Sea, but he can't change a heart. That
Yeah.
blows my mind. And so that is a miracle within itself. That's the miracle of we see from Saul to Paul. And God is still is in that transformation redemption business. And unfortunately, I come across people who may not be willing to accept that, but I realize that's not who this book is for anyway. And
Yeah.
so, um, I tell people, hey, at this point, if you're not okay with my story, you can burn it Fahrenheit, 451 degrees Fahrenheit. The book will burn, or return it. So, yeah. So, but that's just part of it, and accepting that and realizing that for me, I've come to realize that if someone has a problem with my story or anything like that, and they don't want, and they genuinely care about me or care about people, they're gonna email me specifically and we'll discuss it, that sort of thing. But if you want to shame somebody, you leave a comment.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
You only comment hatred like that because you want to publicly shame somebody.
Right.
And unfortunately, we do live in a world where that is very easy at people's fingertips. But thankfully, overall, the majority of people are just going, wow, it's so cool to see God transform somebody's life. And that's what I lean into more than anything.
Yeah. Yeah. There are definitely a lot of keyboard warriors out there
Yeah, it's a
that
good way
want
to
to,
put it.
yeah, that want to, spew their hate. And at the end of the day, I've always found that really it's not even as much about what issue they may or may not have with you. It's really something they're dealing with on their own.
Yeah,
And their way is to just lash out at others for whatever reason. So, you really can only just kind of, pray that at some point they find their own way and whatever is really eating at them, because I can assure you it's not you or what you've done, you
right.
know, that they'll find their own answers and their own healing
Yeah,
at some point. So and it's not easy to, to take that approach when you might be reading something like that, here's someone who's never met you, never sat down, had a conversation with you, um, but they're spewing all this, hate and vitriol at you. It's really crazy, but you do really have to understand it's more about them than it is about you at that point.
yeah. My team and I, we actually, like I said, I've been blessed not to get too much of that. Some other people that I know with similar stories have gotten eaten up, and I am blessed to say that God's just protecting me. But anytime we hear something negative, we turn it into a song and we laugh about it. And that actually is funny to me because I feel like when you can joke about your situation, like you own it instead of it owning you. And I just feel like the enemy goes just shaking its head, going, man, we tried, like I tried so hard to uh count him out or to make him feel like he should just stop what he's doing because we don't want to see him change lives. And then we're laughing about it or singing about it. And then it's like, oh, we can't, well, we weren't able to stop him. And so hopefully the devil will just go on to, leave me alone, move on. Because they realize, yeah, that didn't work this time around. And that's kind of what we lean into is just try to f realize too that I've heard it this way. If you don't run into the devil every now and then, you're probably walking in the same direction.
Yeah.
And that's how I take it too is, negative comments sometimes are simply just the enemy is trying so hard to steal, kill, and destroy even what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
I talk about it in my book. I say the enemy will try so hard to destroy your character, but it's because he cannot touch your calling. Romans tells us that our calling is irrevocable. And so, yeah, he knows he can't touch that. So he's going to mess with your character all day long. He will try to, uh, he's not omniscient, he's not omnipotent, and because of that, I think social media has given him a bigger platform than he's ever had
Oh yeah.
because now now he can finally reach the masses that he's never been able to do before. And because of that, he's sitting behind a keyboard and like, yeah, I can tear this person up to pieces because It's a lot easier, you know, this way. So
Yeah. And I love what you said. It comes back to something that gets mentioned on the show quite a bit is, you can never control what happens to you, whether that's a negative comment or just the chaos that comes on, but you can always control how you react to it.
yeah,
So when those negative things happen, um, your reaction is really the key, not what brought that on. So you can react to it negatively or you can react to it positively. And when you react to it positively, it always, has a much better outcome than, a negative reaction for sure. And that is the
yeah,
one thing you can control is that reaction.
that's so true.
So, no, we've covered a broad range of topics here. Is there anything that we might have missed that you think would be important for the listeners before we start to wrap things up?
I would say that, this book is chaos, overcoming the overwhelming. And one thing I always like to let people know is I'm so thankful that I went from um overwhelming to overcoming, and it's this great story. But overcoming the overwhelming doesn't always have to be shaking hands with the president or some big moment. If you feel like you're just stuck and you're paralyzed from pain and you're laying in your bed today, if you get up out of bed and you say, you know what, I'm going to brush my teeth, I'm going to get dressed, I'm going to fix a meal, that sort of thing, and be productive, you're overcoming your overwhelming for that day. And so don't look at overcoming the overwhelming as always some big major accomplishment. Those little moments add up to a big moment. And I just want to encourage people that you can start overcoming your overwhelming chaos today simply by doing the necessities and start there.
Yep, start with the baby steps for sure. I love that. I love that. No, how can people find you if they want to get a copy of the book? If they just want to reach out to you. If there's somebody who is, going through the reentry process and is struggling, how would they find you on the internet?
They can go to thenoahasher.com, and on the website they can find all the links where to buy the book, like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Walmart, Books a Million, places like that. But they can also see our email address. They can reach out to us. We'd love to hear your story and help you any way we can. All proceeds of this book do go to providing copies for prison libraries and rehab centers across America. So when you're buying your book to read to hopefully help you grow, just know that you're also helping people grow that are behind bars.
Love that. Love that. So, Noah, that brings us to our final question. As you know, the subtitle of the podcast is Many Little People in Many Little Places, which comes from the opening lyrics of a Michael Franti song, Gloria, which go, when many little people in many little places do many little things and the whole world changes. What's one of the little things that Noah does on a daily basis to make the world a little bit better place?
It's so simple. Be kind. It doesn't cost you any money. It doesn't really even cost you time. When you're at a restaurant today and they say, "Hey, my name's such and such. How can I take your order?" Call them by name, ask them how their day's going. Take that little moment. Still tip them. Don't be like, "Well, I called them by name. I'll have to tip them anymore." No, still tip them, but you just be kind. Let people know. One thing I've learned in life is that people want to be seen and they want to be heard. So if you can stop for just a moment and let them know that they have been seen, they've been heard for today, you've made a difference.
Love that. It's a great answer. Noah, I really appreciate taking the time to have this conversation. Very informative. Wish you the best of luck on the tour, the upcoming book tour that you got coming up in the summer here.
Yeah.
And wish you the best of luck with the work you're doing. It's important work, and it's great to connect with somebody that's out there and doing it in the trenches to try to create that change. So really appreciate that. For folks out there listening, be sure to check out my other podcasts and blogs at journeymymotherson.com. While you're there, pick up a copy of one of my books. And again, Noah, really appreciate the time. It's a great conversation.
Yes, thank you so much.
You bet.